to today's session on the convergence of COVID and EU exit. David Sterling, our chair, will kick us off shortly, but I just want to run through some of the housekeeping before that. My name is Anne Dixon. I'm the director at the Chief Executive's Forum, and we will be recording today's session. Katie Hayward, we're delighted to present for around 20 minutes. Then we'll hand over to Simon and Neil from EY, who'll do a similar presentation. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. I would ask if you could, if you have any questions or particular discussion points that occur to you during the presentations, to pop them into the chat function, and we will monitor that throughout the presentations and hopefully pick up those points later on. And we hope to wrap everything up by around 12:30. So with that, I'll hand over to our chair, David Sterling.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many people here. I think that's a reflection of the interest there is in these two huge issues. And indeed, I suppose with the latest twist in the executive's lockdown hokey cokey, I actually thought many of you might have been tempted by some non-essential shopping or a trip to a cafe or the hairdressers before the next lockdown. But anyway, good to see you there, all here. It's, I suppose, coming to the end of 2020, we always tend to look back on the year, but also on the decade. And it has been an extraordinary year at the end of actually quite an extraordinary decade. Like, who would have thought 10 years ago we'd have had 4 general elections, 4 prime ministers, 5 years of coalition government, 10 years of austerity, that we'd be leaving the EU, and to cap it all, we'd be living through a global pandemic. At a local level, we've had 3 assembly elections, almost constant political turmoil, the Stormont House Agreement, the Fresh Start Agreement, 3 years without ministers, new decade, new approach, and in the midst of dealing with COVID-19, we're now only 42 days away from the end of the Brexit transition period, with major uncertainty still about what that will mean for all of us. It's a context which has been uniquely challenging for public service leaders and will continue to be so for some time to come. We have together across the public sector been in some form of crisis management mode throughout the decade. We haven't had a multi-year budget since 2011. The last programme for government that was agreed by the executive was in March 2012. And it looks as if we're going to have a short-term focus for some time to come. The Chancellor's spending review next week will be for 1 year only. And locally, our politicians are increasingly going to be focused on the May 22 Assembly elections. To help us make sense of the combined impact which Brexit and COVID-19 will have for public services, I'm absolutely delighted we're joined this morning by Professor Katie Hayward from Queen's and by Neil Gibson and Simon McAllister from EY Ireland. Katie and Neil in particular will not need much of an introduction, but certainly they are 2 people who have always, in my view, provided really powerful insights into the challenges facing us all. You didn't pay to hear me speak for too long, so without further ado, I will hand over to Katie, who will take us through where we are with, well, give us maybe some insights on the current negotiations and the implications of these for Northern Ireland. Over to you, Katie.
Great, thank you very much, David, and hello, everybody. It's a real privilege to be asked to speak to the Chief Executives Forum. I'm very conscious of the huge responsibilities that you carry and of the privileges that I have as an academic in not having those kind of responsibilities. And being able to speak to you this morning is really, without doubt, a genuine privilege, and I hope to make it as useful as possible for you. So I'm going to share some slides to try and get through quite a bit of information. And I will try not to mess this up. So hopefully you can see this slide now. So yes, so I'm just wanting to really just focus on The implications of EU exit, and I think the main message I'm wanting to get across, not that we're unaware of it, but is to kind of put this in this context of the fact that the dynamics of relationships north-south and east-west are fundamentally changed, and this poses, of course, all sorts of challenges, some opportunities perhaps, mainly challenges in the short term, and fundamentally to recognize that the UK-EU relationship is key. And so much, therefore, is riding on what is decided this week, and hopefully next week in Brussels. So the outline of what I'll talk about is basically where things stand at the moment, the immediate challenges that we face, and I know Neil and Simon will talk about that too, short-term challenges and then longer-term challenges. So some of this, you've seen this slide before if you've ever seen a presentation from David Finmore and myself. This is just basically underlining the fact that we have the protocol, of course, and this is basically, this has changed the context for Northern Ireland, both in practical terms, legal terms, and operationally too. The big change between this protocol and the previous version that we had with Theresa May was one, it's not a backstop, it's a front stop. The other dimension being that there's no commitment from the UK to align in areas of EU law where Northern Ireland will be aligning, and of course that other addition of democratic consent vote in Northern Ireland. But you can see this is quite a good slide for just summarising the quite substantial areas that of course are covered by the protocol. So just there's two sets of negotiations and discussions that are going on at the moment that will fundamentally have a huge impact on the future of Northern Ireland. And what is quite, what we had hoped to avoid, but which has become very much the case, is that the future UK-EU relationship, apologies for my dogs, I'm sorry. The future UK-EU relationship and the implementation of the Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol are completely intertwined at the moment. So the two things have become basically progress being made on implementing the protocol is dependent very much on decisions in the UK-EU future relationship. So the progress that we've seen in that future relationship, apparently there's a 600 page draft text of that treaty. This is rather shorter than we might usually expect of such a significant FTA. And that's basically because the baseline of it would be no tariffs and no quotas. So if you have a zero tariff, zero quota FTA, then the details of the text need to be, you need less detail, of course. The key point being that there's an awful lot in this text that's still in square brackets, bearing in mind that nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. And the decisions pending, the big issues that still remain outstanding, have been the same for months now. So that's governance, level playing field, state aid and fisheries. I think we see the landing point for those, with the exception of fisheries, and we've known them for some time. I think they've become a little bit clearer, possibly since the EU took a harder line after the UK Internal Market Bill. State aid, for example, we know, but we know where that could land. What would be acceptable for both the EU and potentially the UK. And then the key thing is fisheries, and my reading of it would be that it's just a matter of whether Boris Johnson can sell it. And this has been put forward as the issue of sovereignty. And if he's able to sell this, I think quite a lot of the nitty-gritty and indeed the concessions and compromises made in the other areas will be sellable. So what's the deadline? We're all wondering when this on earth will come to pass. Well, in theory, we've been working backwards from the European Parliament plenary on the 16th of December, and the fact that the UK Parliament will go into recess on the 17th of December. But there's an awful lot to happen before that, including the translation of the text into the 23 official languages, and including going through European Parliament, at least 3 committees in the European Parliament. People are talking about the possibility of a special plenary for the European Parliament between Christmas and New Year, which no one will thank us for. But that's a possibility, I guess. And looking at that 17th of December parliamentary recess date, we don't know what the MPs will be prepared to do, but in and of itself, this means that standing orders will have to change in order to process ratification of any future relationship bill very, very quickly, much more quickly than the 21 days that should have been required. And then in relation to the protocol, we've seen some decisions on quite tricky areas. I think the most important one so far is the process for medicines regulation. And this is basically a phased process. So I would take some comfort from the fact that the EU has agreed here to to a phasing in of certain regulations and processes, and important ones too, the same is the case for labelling. So I think that suggests that there is definitely some flexibility there, and a model that won't be widely used, but it sets a bit of a precedent. What are the decisions pending? Well, I should say that the Joint Committee which has to make the decisions ultimately on the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, we were expecting them to meet in mid-November. It could potentially meet next week, but I wouldn't expect it to meet until we have some kind of outcome from the UK-EU future relationships talks. Because the decisions on the protocol, unfortunately, have got caught up in that future relationship. There's a bit of stalling on the annexes, so the technical details of the annexes to the protocol, those can be. We've seen additions being put forward by the EU already to those annexes, and the UK is holding off on accepting those. The big headline point is, of course, defining at-risk goods. UK starting position being that nothing is at risk, the EU's being exactly the opposite of that, really difficult one. And then, of course, we're looking for the details on potential simplifications for GB to NI movement. I think, again, Christian and fish will be resolved if we have a UK-EU agreement. Monitoring arrangements will remain sensitive, but again, we could see some landing point for that. And again, agricultural support, if we have an agreement on state aid, that will help too. I don't think that's going to be too contentious. So in terms of the immediate challenge, this is a slide I'm very proud of, so I'm going to use it again. But essentially, this was just a summary of what I gathered from the most detailed information we have so far from the guidance issued on moving goods under the Northern Ireland Protocol from the early August. And I was determined just to try and tick off what we see movement on and where we have progress. This may not be complete. There may be some things here that I'm missing, but I'm trying to keep up to date on it. The fact that it's difficult to find information is probably telling in and of itself. The key point here is the one in red, which is that legislation on unfettered access, which was in the UK Internal Market Bill. And now that particular clause has been taken out of the UK Internal Market Bill by the Lords. It'll be really interesting to see what happens in that regard. And also defining qualifying status for those NI goods benefiting from unfettered access. We saw that the way that the EU defined this, the UK defined this, is basically anything in free circulation in Northern Ireland. So this is very much a sticking plaster and one that could potentially be problematic unless it's addressed in more detail next year. So legislation in Westminster, I mentioned the UK Internal Market Bill, and I'm not going to get into the weeds in all of this, but it is worth noting that that was the point where we had the legislation for unfettered access, and that is now gone. As I understand it, the government's intention is to put it back in, and I'm of the understanding that the government see that Part 5, as was in the Internal Market Bill, as being a block of clauses and isn't distinguishing between those that broke international law or gave the government the power to do so, and those that are actually quite necessary for Northern Ireland, such as this unfettered access point. We know that the EU has been quite clear, and particularly in the European Parliament has been very clear, it's not going to ratify any future UK-EU relationship agreement if those clauses are there in the Internal Market Bill. And this is, of course, a cause for concern if the UK government is determined to put them back in. The Lords, we may have ping pong, but this is an area of great concern. Also of concern is the point about the finance bill, which we're yet to see, and the promise or threat from the UK government that it will define at-risk goods, something again that is meant to be agreed between the UK and the EU in the Joint Committee, but which the UK government is determined to act unilaterally on. This potentially sets a precedent for the UK government thinking that it might use such tactics in future. This is a grave concern. So if the UK government decides, particularly the Tory party, if it's deciding to reassure some of its more hardline pro-Brexit elements that it can take back control in domestic legislation to breach any uncomfortable international legislation, we have a serious problem. And this is why it'll be interesting to see how this is resolved. Does the government itself withdraw those clauses and keep them out? Or does it, or basically, what is it going to do? We will watch with interest. Also worth noting, of course, as we're all aware, the many hundreds of statutory instruments that are required and have to be processed in theory by the end of this year. I think there's about 306 processed so far, but again, it's a lot of detail to keep on top of. And I do want to mention the common frameworks because they affect a lot of the work, of course, of the public service in Northern Ireland. And I'm happy to answer questions on it. I won't go into too much detail. The reason I have this is basically, so the common frameworks are, in my view, sort of recognizing the principles of the common frameworks explicitly uphold the way of working in devolution within the UK, including the principle of subsidiarity. And as I'm sure many of you are only too painfully aware, it involves an awful lot of hard work and communication and cooperation across the 4 parts of the UK. If you look through it, those ones that are requiring legislation, unsurprisingly, many of those are relevant to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And what we see so far, and the one I've seen drafted on food and feed safety and hygiene, we can see that there's recognition that Northern Ireland may be following different rules, compared to the rest of the UK, but Northern Ireland will still be involved in decisions and discussions around the common framework itself. Also these common frameworks are relevant to North-South cooperation too. It's worth noting that some of those common frameworks, some of those areas which were where EU law intersected with devolved competence, where it was decided back in October 17 that no further action was required. Some of these areas are actually relevant to the protocol, and so maybe action will be required some point down the line. Also too, state aid is, of course, covered by the protocol, and this is something else to keep an eye on, and it will be affected by the UK-EU relationship. Oh, sorry, just one other thing, that specified quantities and packaged goods legislation, that's just to remind me it's in italics because, of course, that's not just affected by the protocol, that's potentially affected too by future FTAs that the UK negotiates. So again, another element of dynamism there. Okay, so those are the immediate challenges. I'm not talking about, I'm sure Simon and Neil will talk about the immediate challenges as they relate to business and the information that we need on that point. So if there is a deal, maybe next week, maybe the week after, this is just basically the essential process that we will expect to see. So there'll be a parliamentary statement, hopefully before it's leaked on a WhatsApp group. Explain of the deal will be published, and then the legal text published maybe a couple of days later. And the hope is then that all stops will be pulled out to get the guidance and information updated rapidly. Of course, so much for Northern Ireland in particular we've been told, well, it's, we can't give you information until the decision is made at that UK-EU level. That's also true of the Joint Committee, of course. And so we'd expect a lot to be issued in very rapidly after there's a deal, and then we'd see that future relationship bill come forward. And on that future relationship bill, we won't see too much that's Northern Ireland specific, but there may be amendments related to Northern Ireland that would be proposed for that bill. This is really just to underline the point that actually, and I don't expect you to read I'll show the slides afterwards, but essentially the point is a no deal UK-EU will have the greatest effect for Northern Ireland in terms of GB to NI. I think that'll be the biggest impact for us, given, of course, the whole point of the protocol, a large part of it, was that even if there's a no UK-EU deal, that we will avoid a hard Irish border, amongst other things. So I think that's unsurprisingly, therefore, why a UK-EU no deal will have such a big impact on GB to NI. The biggest point, of course, will be that it will affect that UK-EU relationship and the knock-on effects for us as a consequence. And then non-trade issues that aren't covered in that graphic, of course, and again, you're far more familiar with the detail of this than I am, but the knock-on effects relating to sharing of data, obviously services, policing cooperation, as the Minister for Justice was saying earlier this week, huge implications there. And then implementing the protocol from the 1st of January. So as you're all aware, the EU has been saying it wants the protocol to be implemented in full from the 1st of January. Operationally, that's simply not possible. It's just not going to happen. And the big risk here is that the stability of the protocol itself is at stake. Thinking about this as a long-term, as I say, it's something that's completely changed Northern Ireland's position. So the long-term protocol, stability of the protocol is at stake. It depends a lot on what happens on the 1st of January. And Aidan Connolly said, because of the queasiness of talking about a border operation model for GB to NI, and also to queasiness in talking about an implementation period, Aidan Connolly of Retail Consortium NI have said, well, you can call it pink fluffy bunny period if you like. The key thing is what it does. What is interesting is that Northern Ireland business is asking for this, and it's not an official UK government request. And I think this is significant because it's suggesting that if it is allowed, and I would be hopeful of flexibility from the EU on this matter, it would be in a response to Northern Ireland's own expressed needs, directly expressed from business here, and also that it would be, if you like, a unilateral decision almost by the EU, rather than something that's negotiated, although in reality it'd be negotiated, but it wouldn't necessarily be presented as such. And I think that's quite interesting. That would be quite a positive precedent in some ways. But if we were to have such a period, be it well publicized or not, it does require an ability for the EU to trust the UK, and it also requires a confidence in the trajectory of implementation. So the UK government needs to be able to demonstrate quite clearly that it is in the process of implementing the protocol. 2021, because some of those statutory instruments that have been put forward aren't necessarily going to last the course. They're just designed to get us over the hurdle of the 1st of January. We can expect phase 2 of some of these to be coming into play, and therefore there'll be quite a lot of complexity around that and continued challenge and change for business. And then looking ahead, of course, as we're all well aware, the statutory instrument for the democratic consent vote has been published now. The consent vote will just be on these Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol. And interestingly enough, whereas the protocol itself said the government has to provide the opportunity for this vote, the SI is very much ensuring that there will be a vote and there will be a decision from Northern Ireland, come what may. Anyway, that's coming into force now. So we can expect continued politicization of the protocol. Longer term challenges. So this is a dynamic arrangement in the protocol, and where the protocol leaves Northern Ireland is one in which is continuing to be affected by the evolving EU acquis, UK-EU relationship more generally, and then what the UK negotiates with the rest of the world, and the fact that the UK-Japan FTA recognised that there could be inconsistency with the protocol. I think is just a heads up for us that this is something that we're going to become more familiar with. And just on that dynamic arrangement, so in the protocol, if a Union Act is amended or replaced, that is covered by the annex, then that would automatically apply in Northern Ireland. And then if the EU thinks is legislating in an area that is relevant to the protocol, it would notify Joint Consultative Working Group and then the Joint Committee of that. And then we have that potential point if the Joint Committee can't agree about that act of regulation applying in Northern Ireland, then we have the possibility of the EU taking remedial action. So that's just something to be aware of, rather than to worry too much about at this stage, but it's definitely pointing to the fact that we have a dynamic arrangement here. And this, of course, has knock-on effects for the UK internal market. So this is possibly partly why we have the internal market bill, and I won't get into the weeds on that. Happy to answer any questions on it. And also it has knock-on effects for North-South cooperation, of course. And it's worth noting in the 2018 Withdrawal Act that all those, the capacity for SIs around implementing the Withdrawal Act or relating to areas of retained EU law, there won't be any regulations allowed which diminish any form of North-South cooperation. So essentially, we're going to have this element whereby we're looking at these new regulations coming in, and yet we have to be able to check for the potential impact on Northern Ireland's place in the internal market and then North-South cooperation. And this is just the governance arrangements that we know are being set up for overseeing the implementation of the protocol. And the reason I've just got that here is just to sort of remind us of the fact that in the protocol itself, Article 6 on the UK internal market says that the Joint Committee will keep under constant review the need to make sure that nothing in the protocol prevents is having a negative effect on Northern Ireland's place in the internal market. And also the Joint Committee is to keep under constant review the need to maintain the conditions for North-South cooperation. So that Joint Committee has a huge amount of responsibility. Therefore, we're hoping that UK-EU relationship will not be in too much tension. I completed a report with David Finnell and Milena Komarova in May. It needs updating. It has 80 recommendations. You probably got a bit carried away, but we will refine our recommendations in relation to the Joint Consultative Working Group. But just a couple of things to mention. So we've seen the terms of reference for that Joint Consultative Working Group, which is basically where after the end of transition period, this will have a big responsibility around informing the UK-EU, the Specialised Committee, and then the Joint Committee on the potential impact of, or the actual impact of, the protocol. The UK delegation to that will include the executive and civil service representatives from here, but the question is how will that information be gathered to feed up into the Joint Consultative Working Group, and how will we have civic representation to the JCWG, etc. That's something that's still to be determined. There's a need to make the most of the 1998 agreement institutions, not least in giving information to the Commission, and that's sort of keeping the sense that this thing is alive, a dynamic protocol with significant consequences, north, south, east, west. And also we made a recommendation in this report about Northern Ireland's position in Brussels and its representation of its interests there. And we made some recommendations on that based on looking at examples from, say, the EFTA countries and regions. So just to conclude, if we have a deal, there's a risk that it could be the high point in the UK-EU relationship. The question is, what will Johnson use to sell the deal? This is necessary. And as I mentioned before, do we have, will that gun remain under the table of this potential use of a notwithstanding clause in future? This I think is a real concern. Also, looking ahead, Northern Ireland is likely to bear the brunt of UK-EU and intra-UK tensions. That's not meant to sound quite so negative, but it's essentially to say that we will very much feel the impact of divergence between the UK and the EU. And this will happen in a very different context. So already we're seeing a decrease in information sharing and transparency, if you like, of what's happening at the UK-EU level. Perhaps that's understandable. It'll get even more difficult post-January. We don't even know if there'll be maybe a commissioner put in charge of keeping an eye on the protocol. We don't know that. So there are upsides to that, but there are also downsides too. And then finally, we have this tension of making the protocol work. So this is the tension in the environment of the divergence between the UK and the EU, which is obviously what Brexit is about. But also the tension of making it work in a situation where you have the risk or the narrative or the hope for some that part of that protocol will only last 6 years. So 2 years following a no vote in the democratic consent vote, regardless of whether that's considered likely or not. That sense of it being potentially a temporary matter or temporary arrangement is one that isn't necessarily ideal for realizing and then meeting the challenges that the protocol gives rise to. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Katie. Clearly, an awful lot of uncertainty still around and much to be done in a very short period of time. It's going to be messy, more messy than pink fluffy bunny, I suspect. But on that, I will hand over to Neil now. Neil, you're going to give us, Neil and Simon are going to give us their view of the impact of this and some sense of how they see the outlook going forward. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you, David. I've never had pink fluffy bunny in the intro to me ever before. And Katie mentioned that she was quite proud of one of her slides and used it again. And she's right to do that because I normally use it in my talks, credited, of course, but can't do that today. I'm going to, first of all, hand you over to Simon. Now, Simon McAllister, so most I know on this call, Simon will be new to some of you. He's our Brexit lead in across the island and writes our Brexit Watch commentary that I know some of you follow and helps and leads all of our efforts across the firm, dealing with clients north and south, big and small, to deal with some of the challenges that they're facing and the complexity of some of those slides. I'm going to hand to him. He'll speak for a few minutes about what we're seeing with our clients, reflecting on Katie's piece, and then I'll talk a little bit about the economic outlook. But please, I know you won't get to ask everything you might today. Come directly back to myself or Simon if there's anything we touch on today that we can't cover fully. So I will hand over to all things Brexit and EY. Simon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Neil. And thank you as well to David in his intro for not crediting Professor Gibson as he did with Professor Hayward, because that would have made my lack of professorship feel all the more stark, and I would have felt very underpowered.
Okay, mine's quasi-fake, don't worry.
Okay. I'll work out where I can get one after this. I'm just going to talk a bit about maybe some initial just reflections for what they're worth, talk a bit about how we're sort of seeing and hearing people's views around Northern Ireland and around business preparation more generally. So, I mean, Katie talked about the deadlines, and I suppose I might sort of go from the other direction and back, and I'm thinking back to a conversation I had with a client on Monday who said, you must be really looking forward to the 31st of December when your role as Brexit lead comes to an end. And after I stopped laughing and explained to him why I think we'll be living with this for a bit like COVID for quite some time, like the reality is that we will have very direct, tangible, unpleasant business impacts all the way through 2021, in my view. I think we'll be then dealing with longer lasting economic impacts, both sides of the border and in the UK, and to a lesser extent then in Europe beyond that. And then, and Katie touched on some of this, I think we will have a lot of social impacts in terms of our relationship in every direction, north and south of the border, east, west, and with the EU as well. And those impacts, I think, will go way beyond any of the economic things, which ultimately can be fixed and will eventually correct and get to their own level. But some of the social impacts, I think, in terms of how the process has been run, not just the initial decision, but then the process and what it has meant for trust in many spheres of it, and I'll touch on one of them at the end, it is going to be very slow to come back. My own kind of tuppence on where we are in terms of negotiations, I would probably put the probability of no deal at a worryingly high level. Maybe by accident, as some call it, that we sort of almost just slither into it rather than it being a decision by somebody on either side. And that's effectively that the EU will probably just be as open as they can to getting to a deal, and that without someone calling it, that we just end up out of time, effectively at Christmas. I think, based on my own sort of look at the politics of it as well, I think the climb down that's needed, particularly on the UK side, looks difficult to deliver. I think things like Dominic Cummings leaving, I wouldn't be of the sort of view that really helps a deal. I think if anything, it's unhelpful because he's potentially there on the sidelines, along with others, in the sort of Brexit camp like Farage and others, who will be saying, I wouldn't have done it that way, and sort of sniping from the sidelines. So it could end up making it harder. As I said, the EU, I think we've seen be very, very flexible. They've tried to talk about deadlines, but we've, and just like the UK imposed deadlines, we've kind of either blasted or slid past most of them. And I think that's quite deliberate from the EU side, that they are willing to just give it until the death. They're willing to try and find, and ultimately the EU is well stacked with clever lawyers, they will try and find inventive ways of trying to compress the review deadline in potentially, and this has been starting to be talked about in the last couple of weeks, in finding ways that don't use the horrible word extension or transition or anything else like that, which again wouldn't fly in London, but finding ways of having an implementation period or something like that, even if it's only a couple of months in particular areas of whatever deal may eventually be agreed. I think the challenge that I struggle with, and that I know our clients are struggling with, is that trying to work out, where any of the truth of what I've just said lies is so exceedingly difficult, because all we're going on is what public utterances are made, which are understandably anodyne in most cases on both sides. And then the more, juicier parts of it, whether you want to call it gossip or anything else, which is leaks, and leaks by design are generally feeding someone's agenda, and that's on both sides. So we know that it's difficult to be rational about it. We know that trying to discern the reality is difficult. I often get accused of being too logical and too rational about things. I gave up trying to apply that lens to Brexit long ago, and I've done a lot better since then. But that's where businesses are coming from, is they're trying to, many of them are trying to apply a rational view to this, that if we work back from a deadline, we need X period. If we work back from that to make changes, we need that period. And they're doing a critical path analysis, and they're doing a review of where the pinch points will be. And they're doing that to the political process as well, because they're trying to join the two together. And then they keep being disappointed because the process has ended up the way it is. That means that for many businesses, and I'll kind of go jurisdiction by jurisdiction in a second, that the levels of preparation are highly variable, is probably the most charitable way of putting it. And in Northern Ireland, even more so, and particularly because of the issues with the application of the protocol and some of the issues that Katie has highlighted on the slides. David mentioned uncertainty. Like, if sorry I was on mute isn't the phrase of 2020, uncertainty is probably the word of 2020, because it has just been what businesses feel like they've been living with. And again, and the title of this I think is perfect, is just that convergence of the COVID issues, which have been anywhere from disruptive to catastrophic for businesses, to Brexit, which is going to be the same. And unfortunately for some sectors, if we get to no deal, And thinking of some like agri-food and others, it will be verging on catastrophic. It was interesting, during the week we released our UK attractiveness survey, which is looking at FDI investments into Northern Ireland, or sorry, into the UK as a whole. They have found that 2021 really looks quite poor in terms of a decline. But I thought it was quite interesting that the bulk of that seems to be driven by COVID rather than necessarily by Brexit. And that the 3-year outlook, so once we're past any COVID and sort of COVID recovery plans have been put into place in every country, that the outlook for the UK is a bit more positive. Trying to then segregate the Northern Irish part of that, I think, and relying on some of the interactions I've had with clients, 6, 7, 8 months ago, I was having conversations with clients about how do we make the most of the protocol where potentially we have this dual regime or foot in either camp. And they were asking really detailed questions about, if we source product here and send it there and then ship it here, and and all of the permutations of that, is there some advantage to be gleaned? I haven't had one of those conversations in quite a while, because they've given up trying to work it out. Because now there is as much a suspicion that it may be a dual regime that leads to dual levels of headache or paperwork or complexity, that they've kind of moved on, and they're saying, okay, well, this is just too hard to work out. There's too much uncertainty and variability in where we land. Let's just look at somewhere else because it's simpler. And any potential arbitrage opportunity that's there doesn't seem to be emerging with enough either clarity or scale to make it worth the effort of someone sitting in Milwaukee or Shanghai or wherever the case may be. So we know that Brexit, whilst the sort of headlines of that survey seem reasonably positive, we know at an individual level that it is impacting investment decisions. Maybe just think about some of the preparation levels then. So in the Republic, I would say again, like, it's really mixed. It's very, so it's mixed then by 2 lenses, one by size. So SMEs, more or less as a rule, are badly prepared. Larger businesses like PLCs are much better prepared. And then in the sectoral view, we have some like agri-food, who again, there's a split. Some are at the end of implementing their contingency plans. So Carberry down in West Cork last week commissioned their new mozzarella plant. That's aimed at moving away from cheddar. Cheddar is only eaten really in Ireland, the UK, and Russia. Russia are still under sanctions, so that leaves a pretty poor market. Glanbia the same, have diversified away from cheddar, and they're pressing ahead with another investment aimed at making Gouda. So which isn't eaten a lot here, but it's again export driven and all aimed at diversifying away from the UK. But that is the conclusion of a 2 or 3 year process where they knew they had this issue. They knew they had a long lead time on making investments, getting planning permission, changing over to it, and sourcing those markets as well. And this is a piece that it's important for, and particularly amongst our political leaders, to realize. And I think back to a comment about 2 years ago from one of our politicians here who said, you just need to open up a new market. And it's like clicking your fingers and it'll happen. And the reality, of course, is that can be a 2 to 5 year process for most businesses. So the size is the biggest issue for Brexit preparation here. We know that they just don't have the resources in many cases to do it in terms of cash for getting paid for advice. They don't have lots of people who they can redeploy to dealing with Brexit issues. And a lot of them are dealing with COVID, and that's the fire that's burning brightest at the moment. In the UK, we have seen a really, really significant pickup in the last 2 months. And a lot of businesses have now reacted, partly panic, partly, triggering contingency plans to do a lot of work around trying to work out the exact impact and trying to put contingency plans in place. So it's not about coming up with contingencies, it's about implementing contingencies. And again, that would be probably less mixed than here. I think it's quite evenly spread, particularly across sectors, and obviously a bigger impact on those who are exporters or importers. And then in Northern Ireland, I think we had certainly seen a pickup towards the end of the summer in terms of clients trying to look for help and look for advice on what to do. They were kind of getting to the start line of pulling the trigger on something. And then for a lot of them, they've actually parked that again, because as we came into the autumn and as either announcements were made or not made, the level of uncertainty actually grew rather than going the other way. And they have sort of said, well, this is just too hard. We'll just have to wait. And obviously, we continue to wait and we continue to get closer and closer to the deadline. And without a lot of that clarity that businesses are looking for, and Katie again had a lot of that on her slides. And probably the biggest one that we would hear is that definition of goods at risk, because it just drives so many other complexities. Because it impacts a large part of their business. And I know Neil has a few slides later on, which one of them will show the areas in which we sort of work with clients around thinking about where Brexit impacts their business, which in very simple terms is everything potentially, but then there are certain segments of the business are more impacted. And for Northern Ireland businesses who are importing or exporting, which is a very large proportion of them, it's their supply chain. It's everything to do with customs and duties. And then it's the finance sphere, because they will potentially have working capital issues around financing all those supply chains. They will have VAT changes, which is one of the areas, thankfully, we do have clarity on. But they're, to deal with those VAT changes, even though there is clarity, they need to make a lot of system changes. Businesses are understandably very careful, and public sector, about making big changes to big IT systems because of where they have the potential to go wrong. And time is short on putting those changes into place. One other thing I think we've seen, which is again unhelpful, is over the last couple of weeks, kind of coming from the back of the field, as it were, is the issue of equivalence decisions on financial services and data. And even though those were areas which weren't explicitly part of the trade deal, or are explicitly not part of the trade deal, and some, that has given people a lot of worry around data transmission in particular. I did a presentation on Wednesday to a data center conference, and the issues around potentially segregating data and the complexity of what they'll be allowed to transmit to or from the UK is really, really serious for pure data operators like that, but then obviously serious for everyone who's transmitting data, which is as simple as sending an email. And about 2 years ago, we moved our Republic of Ireland email provision to be serviced by a EU server because it was in London, and we wanted to protect against this potential issue we're getting to now. It's probably interesting to wonder whether those two issues have come back as the EU applying them as leverage in the trade deal, or is there really a potential that we could end up with no equivalence decisions? Briefly, again, just going back to that preparation issue, the financial services sector, by and large in Ireland, have, Brexit kind of happened about 18 months ago for them. They have finished, they're to the point where they've reallocated the car parking, having brought in new staff, moved functions, moved balance sheets. But this issue around equivalence for FS would still have very significant impacts, not just in the UK, but in Europe as well. And we need London exchanges to do a lot of our euro-based trades, which we can't just move them over to somewhere in Dublin or Amsterdam or Frankfurt overnight. When we do client sessions, or when we do webinars or anything else, just to give you an insight into what people are looking for, beyond clarity, it's usually questions around customs, and it's questions around the impact on their supply chains, and it's all, the questions we get are incredibly detailed, too detailed to deal with in things like webinars. And it's that we import this from X, that product originally comes from Y, we do this to it here, we get a bit of it from Northern Ireland, we get a bit of it from, and then we export it to, and largely they're coming from SMEs, and largely they just have no idea what's required of them. And that is despite the fact that there are quite good, supports from the likes of the enterprise boards in Ireland or Enterprise Ireland, and maybe some a little less guidance on the UK side because of the lack of clarity on some of these issues, and particularly what the definition of unfettered will mean in practice. But they're the kinds of questions they're asking. They aren't extending the sort of areas they're considering into the other parts of the sort of areas I talked about earlier in terms of where else their business is impacted. It's very practical, very tangible, and that's the kind of advice they're looking for first and foremost. The other issue, which it doesn't come up on those kinds of sessions, and I call that an issue, which is the issue of services more generally. And we know that if there is any trade deal, it's likely to be somewhere between, and I won't pick two skinny people as examples, but skinny and very skinny. And the degree to which it doesn't cover services is really poorly understood, in my view, by most businesses. And even if you say it to them, they don't quite grasp what we mean by services and what the reality could be for a UK provider of some sort of maintenance services, or where they're flying people in to Ireland or into any EU country to deliver a service, whether it's tax advice or whether it's some sort of consultancy around anything else in your business, and they don't appreciate the impact that that could have. And add to that the potential immigration issues depending on your nationality and everything else, less so for us, but more so for European countries. So maybe just to conclude, I mean, I think the title of this is about implications, and my own kind of thoughts for what they're worth on this is 3 of them, just to maybe consider, beyond saying businesses are going to need a lot of support, and that's kind of obvious, but that is the reality. The supports, I think, need to be quite carefully considered, and one of the criticisms I would have of Brexit supports in the Republic is that generally they tend to be a debt-focused option. The last thing most businesses need is more debt. The last thing they want is more debt. They've been eroding reserves dealing with COVID as it is. Offering them debt at cheap rates, it's not the best answer, because, okay, it may be cheap, but you still have to pay the money back. So the nature of supports, I think, needs to be very carefully considered. They need to be very targeted. So I think, prioritizing those sectors that will be most impacted has to be the way in which they get applied. And again, the COVID supports are maybe a good lens for that. When things were going downhill very rapidly in March and April, countries were applying shotgun approaches to supports, which was the right thing to do at the time, to keep money moving, to keep money in the economy, keep businesses open. And then we've gradually seen those being a bit more tailored. I think the same needs to happen with Brexit supports. The second issue, I think, is that we need to find a way of enhancing the dialogue between the public sector and businesses, and making sure that public sector leaders have a really good way of getting visibility on the kinds of issues businesses are dealing with and what those issues mean in practice. And I think that has been an issue that we've seen, here, and maybe more so at the political level than at the public sector level, that there was really a poor awareness, I think, of the degree to which the Northern Ireland economy and the supply chains were very heavily integrated with the Republic of Ireland, either just in terms of transport routes through Dublin Port, or, and I'm thinking of one supermarket where a lot of their fulfillment to Northern Ireland stores actually runs through a warehouse in Dublin. The rest of it comes from Scotland. So they're left with a really complex situation now based on whichever way the protocol ends up being implemented. And then I think the final issue is, and it's certainly at the political sphere rather than, I think, the public sector itself or the civil services, I think there needs to be a way to rebuild trust between business and politicians. I think that trust has been really significantly impacted by the way in which the Brexit process has been managed, where ideologies on both sides and red lines and everything else were thrown out, and the practical realities on people's businesses, people's jobs, and the future for certain, whether it's communities or sectors, was, and I'll choose my words carefully, they were put behind other priorities. And I think that has impacted that level of trust. And I think politicians in particular, and I emphasize, I don't lay this at the civil service in any jurisdiction, I think that trust will be very, very slow to rebuild, but I think it's going to be a really important part of how we all build back after this. So I've talked a lot about uncertainty. I'm going to throw it back to Neil to bring some certainty to it, because he will tell us that he knows exactly what's going to happen, and we'll see where we go.
Thank you, Simon. And conscious, want to leave enough time for you all to ask your questions of Katie and Simon in particular. Our latest forecast is out, the Economic Eye out earlier in the week, so that is available. I know it's been sent to you. So I'm not going to go through a lot of detail. I've only got 3 slides, you'll be glad to know. But what I want to try and do is speak a little bit more to the theme of what that report is and how that might affect you as public sector leaders. And that theme was bouncing back or stepping forward. So are we trying to get back to the world that we had in 2019, or are we trying to craft and shape something a little bit different? And quite patently, the answer to that is we're trying to shape something a little bit different. We'll never be quite the same as we were pre-COVID, and Brexit will, in some form or other, as we've just heard, have happened. And clearly that will reshape the way we live, work, socialize, do business, trade. So there will be reshaping and reworking. And to try and skew a little bit more positive, what we have seen is some remarkable ability to adapt by firms and citizens and governments and many of you to do things you didn't believe were possible before this crisis began. Whether that be working more flexibly, whether it be getting decisions done, getting legislation passed, or in business sense, operating completely new models and new systems. And in maybe some small way, the very tragic distraction of COVID has kept some of the minutiae of Brexit off the front pages. There wouldn't be a client, well, there may be a fisheries client, but there wouldn't be too many clients of mine that would be able to look at Katie's slides and not be incredulous that something like fisheries could be the big holdup to this huge trade deal. And yet that's what these things come down to. Businesses have been very distracted with COVID and all the changes that that's brought. And maybe that's allowed a little bit of this conversation to take place out of the spotlight somewhat. It's also been the case that it has shown a real fragility in our economies. Double-digit unemployment rates in many European economies, even in somewhere like Northern Ireland, where the furlough scheme has kept those official measures of unemployment lower. We have seen around 2/5 of the labour market having been disrupted. That means, 2 out of every 5 workers have either lost their job, gone on to furlough, or in self-employed scheme support. Now, that's a staggering number. And that has, if we want to talk resilience again and try to be positive, many clients have said to me, well, none of the Brexit projections were as bad as this. Nobody thought we'd ever be closed. So if we can deal with that, we can deal with whatever. You tell me the paperwork, you tell me the cards I have to play, and I'll play them the best of my ability, and I'll deal and I'll respond quickly. It can't be worse than what I've just been through. Now, you can look at that 2 ways. You can look at that positively, shows a resilience and a can-do attitude and deal with anything. Or you can be more worried, to some of Simon's points, that maybe the preparation isn't there for some of the just practical things that need done. But I certainly have been encouraged that when sometimes we can get a little bit downhearted, when you see some of the complexity in Katie's slides and the number of things that need dealt with, it's been remarkable to me that once we know what it is, just how rapid and mobile our firms can and might be. And for some of you in public life, in which you have an economic role or supporting or providing grants or looking at how your local area, your local council, businesses, your local, from a central government point of view, what sort of supports, as Simon has said, that's probably one of the most challenging journeys ahead, is how to tailor that support. You will have already seen the calls, which I knew would come, to say, well, you were basically able to print money to solve the problem of COVID and say, we'll just pay you because you can't work. How would you not do the same for something as catastrophic as Brexit? So if we ended up in a tariff situation or even a extra paperwork east and west situation for Northern Ireland, there will be a very strong clamour to say, well, this is as devastating to me as COVID was to the arts. So you will need to provide the same extent of funding to simply get me through. And as both previous speakers have said, the 1st of January won't be the end of this. If it's a mutually damaging situation, there'll be frantic attempts to try and fix it. So again, you'll have that narrative of tide me over until it gets clearer. And that is going to be a very difficult demand on public policy when we're not sure what the other side, at least with COVID, you can say, I know what it looks like when the world doesn't have the same extent of this vaccine, because many things are not fundamentally broken or you're not able to return to them in some, albeit modified form. But actually, some of the, if we were in a long-term tariff situation, some trade would simply be uneconomic. One other little positive before I give you the forecast is that the ability for digital and technology to do things has been impressive to me. I remember at the very start in some of the early conversations that myself, Katie and others did, House of Lords, committees, and I said, look, I somewhat optimistically said at the time, look, let's hope that if we do have some difficulties around paperwork, that the technology will allow us to do some, track and trace of goods. It'll allow us to monitor where things are. There's no person that fills up their truck with milk and says, I'm not sure exactly how much is in it and I don't know where I'm sending it. So there must be some level of paper that tells us where things are, and maybe technology can help us. And somebody much more learned than I said to me, well, Neil, you don't know that those systems can exist. And I rather cheekily said, I know that, but you also don't know that they don't exist and couldn't. And I think one of the things in COVID has been, my goodness, we can put up new technology when it's required. And that gives me a little bit of comfort that, unnecessary and complicated as it may be and difficult, I think there is a sense of, okay, what's needed, let's get it in place, we can get it done. And maybe we will see that actually improve some businesses by having better data and better monitoring and tracking. And that might be a small, very small positive. So look, in terms of the forecast, I'm actually not going to, the slides can be sent out afterwards, don't need them for the purposes of this to keep us to time. The Northern Ireland forecast from us is about -10%, that in GDP terms. That's very similar to most of the other forecasters, Danske, Oxford, UEPC, Property Pal, who produce outlooks, and a rebound of about between 5 and 6% next year. But GDP isn't the best number, as we all know. It's essentially the sum of wages and profits in an economy. And without getting too technical, the way the UK measures government spending is that it measures the value added, or GDP, through the value of the activities or the activities carried out. So if there are no classes being taught or there are no operations happening, GDP falls. The Republic of Ireland doesn't measure it like that. It measures it in wages and profits, and so the wages haven't fallen. So if you look at the two economies, government spending in the Republic is contributing positively to GDP, about 14% in Q2. It's contracting by about 14% in the UK, and actually the spending levels are broadly the same. And that's a very boring technical point, but if you don't want to read the Economic Eye and you're able to sleep okay without such reading materials, then the key message you would take from it is that actually the level of disruption domestically is very, very similar in the Republic as it is in Northern Ireland and the UK. That shouldn't surprise anyone. You know, unlike Brexit, which is all about borders, pandemics don't give a toss about borders and don't recognize any of them. So therefore, they have had a very similar level of domestic disruption across the economy. Now, that has opened our eyes to just how important many of those sectors, retail, culture, arts, leisure, sports, entertainment, are to our labour market. And that's certainly going to be pretty, if you look at the Republic of Ireland, despite their GDP only being down maybe 4% this year, its Q2 GDP was only down 6%, not the 20% in the UK and Northern Ireland. But yet its unemployment, its adjusted unemployment, is over 20% today, whereas in Northern Ireland we're looking at 7%. How does that? Well, it's simply to do with the policies enacted. So in Northern Ireland, the big numbers are on furlough. Maybe, I'm sure it's up now from the 70,000 we had estimated, maybe 80,000 people on furlough in a labour market of about 900,000 at work. Whereas in the Republic of Ireland, they had a pandemic unemployment payment, of which there are over 300,000 people on it today. So they have an adjusted unemployment of 20%. We have an unemployment of 7%. But the bottom line is, it's a very similar level of people at risk or disrupted today. So what does that mean for you as public sector leaders? A couple of really important. So the forecast is tough, fairly strong recovery. One very important point to make is that when we were free to open up, eat out, to help out, whatever else was in place, people are extremely eager to be back out and spending again. Cash balances have built up considerably. I have huge optimism that our culture, sport, art, leisure, tourism, retail sectors will be very buoyant. High street retail, tourism from overseas visitors, a bit tougher. In fact, some of high street retail may be long-term very difficult because of online. But for many of those other sectors, people are desperate to get some of 2019 back again. We'll be forever changed, but we recognize the value of sport, culture, the cinema, arts, all the classy and sophisticated things that public sector leaders do, or in my case, chicken wings and a trip to see Iron Maiden at Ormeau Park. But those kind of things will be desperate to get back into our lives, to be with loved ones, with colleagues, to have some fun again, to have a pint, a meal, a social experience. So I try to say to all of those clients, and would do if you're engaging with any of them locally, the demand for you and the importance of what you bring is as strong as it has ever been. When it's safe to do so, I expect a very strong bounce back. And for some of us, it's our job to keep things going till that happens. But finally, for me, just to give you a couple of observations that might be relevant for you in the public sector. Number one, expectations will be very high that you are still there to try and help and guide and support the economy and society through this. That might be through the employment that you offer, the safe jobs that you're providing in your local communities, or it may be more directly through the interventions that you provide and support. One of the things I would say is very important is we need Brexit's one example of it. Elections of presidents is another. We are clearly not having the best conversations we could and should have as a society. We're struggling to have sophisticated arguments, commentary out there that people can absorb and understand to make decisions. We're in the world of picking the two most extreme positions and putting them on TV or radio so that they can fight with each other and pass that off as a way of adding information and knowledge. And we're going to have to do better at that. And as public service, we have some role in that, in providing the right information, or put it another way, staying close to our citizens. So do you know who's opening and closing in your local area or in the area in which you're responsible for? Do we know who's falling out of unemployment work? I see Beverly on the call, done with Beverly and others. Who's falling into unemployment? Who's ending up needing support? Exactly who they are, what are their conditions? Between analytics, qualitative work, you have to be able to know that you hear the voices of the people who don't always speak the loudest. I'm thinking of many of the young who don't have a job, maybe some of the old and the elderly who've had the most isolated and difficult year that they have ever imagined. We have a lot to do to try and make sure we redress some of that balance in the next year. And they may not be the people who speak the loudest or come on the radio shows or provide a contrary point to be on the radio or the TV in the evening. I'm trying to be measured about, some of you may wonder why I appear less in the media these days. That's partly because I'm trying to be as measured as I can, and that's not very popular. So you have to think about how we can inform and add information. A couple of positives for you. You will have found new ways of working, some of which you can absorb and bring in, can maybe deploy some staff in different ways that you hadn't thought about before. We've seen things like on the Housing Association, we've seen some legislation coming through. There's great sympathy for the fact that we need to do better as a society to protect people. There's a sense of fragility that allows you to craft legislation to make progress in a way that maybe you couldn't do before. Maybe that's planning permissions, maybe that's changes of ways of working that you've wanted to do for a very long time. And the very last positive point is talent. Public sector, lots of vacancies, lots of stories in the news about not being able to get all the people you need. This is going to be a time when many private sector firms we've had the tough 2020, but even into 2021, they're now coming back and having the conversations. Do I need an office? Do I need a print room? Do I need all the staff that I had before? And if that's the case, then that potentially opens up the opportunity for you. And as I always say, and I've said to David for a very long time, with the right branding and marketing, you have something that most private sector firms, including EY, are fighting desperately to have, which is a sense of purpose, culture, and identity. We are here to solve the biggest problems in the world. My old job as an academic, and I know Katie the same. That ability, she said at the start of her speech, the privilege of being an academic, we can get people back into some of these sectors that have been starved of talent because of some of the challenges that are out elsewhere. So one of the positives I would end with is you can be a very significant player in creating new jobs, new apprentices, new energy and problem-solving people, and maybe you'll get your hands on some of the talent that is sitting unable to find work because of the crisis we've had. So very tough outlook, yes. We will not find our way back to 2019, but we did leave some things at the side of the road back then that we're desperate to go back and pick up again. So we'll have a reshaped world, hopefully with some of the best of what was in our lives in 2019, and maybe with some new digital progress and ways of working that make us a little bit more resilient and adaptive to what's going to be the massive challenge that Katie and Simon spoke to. Figures are there, I know you do, but please come back to me, Simon, the team, if you need anything else that we didn't cover today, and I'll hand you back over to David, I think. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Simon. Three very thought-provoking presentations there. A lot of information for us to digest. I'm glad, Neil, you, as always, you ended on a positive note, and it would be easy on a grey day in late November like this to be gloomy and downhearted about all of this. But I think the challenge for us as public sector leaders, as we have done many times before, is to rise up to the challenges ahead of us. Just first sort of question for me, there aren't many questions in the chat as yet, and I would encourage people to come forward that way, or to raise a blue hand or a physical hand, whatever, if you want to come in. But Neil, your forecasts, do they take account of the likelihood of an effective vaccine coming in line with what we're being told over the last week or so?
Thanks, David. No, at the time of production of those, we had basically built in two assumptions. One was some form of either low impact of COVID, either be that through vaccination or through the hope that the second wave, once we entered the spring, that would really fade back to the numbers we saw in late autumn. But we didn't have some of the mass vaccination in that might not only provide a little bit of a further consumer spending boost later in the year, but might give the confidence for some people earlier in the year to make investment decisions or things that they put on pause. So that's a little upside. On the flip side of that, though, we did assume there would be there's a no tariff position, that we'd get a last minute light touch free trade agreement. So there is a downside that things could be a bit tougher if, as Simon suggests, he's still a bit on the pessimistic side that and here's a lot more than I would. And if we do end up in that situation, that could pull it down a bit. So yeah, the vaccine could provide a little bit of positivity. And very quickly, the eat out to help out. Now, there's many now looking back and say that wasn't a great idea because, infections and so forth. But really, we don't know that for sure. What we can tell from an economic point of view was how fantastically well that was embraced. I've spoken to so many people who've eaten in a restaurant that they never ate in before and will be keen to go back to. And so that gives us an idea that those kind of voucher schemes, direct incentive, time limited things, whether they're, we went for a stamp duty holiday because they thought the property market would be on its knees. In hindsight, they probably wouldn't have done that again because it hasn't shown that to be the case thus far. But whether it's scrappage schemes, voucher schemes, overnight stays, specific incentives that are time limited, can only be used in that the less dead weight, it gives us a little bit of a blueprint for the way that when it's safe to do so, wouldn't we go to all our schools and say, here's some way that we're going to get every child into a museum or an art gallery before 2021's out? You can think of things that we could do that would encourage some of the behavioral changes, because there will be people after living it with a year will be very nervous and anxious. So we need to be as confident with our encouragement to go out and do as we have been with our advice to stay in and not do.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Colin McKenna, can I call Colin in? And then Katie, I think, would like a question as well, but we'll go to Colin first.
David, thank you. Colin McKenna here. I'm here today as chairman of the Northern Ireland Food Advisory Committee of the Food Standards Agency. So obviously the impending January 1st sort of deadline is quite high on our agenda. And just, Katie, you touched a little on it during your presentation around I don't use the term, but trusted trader scheme and that sort of thing that we will need in order to be able to ensure that we get proper food supplies. And one thing that we're quite concerned about is that there could be difficulty in stocking supermarket shelves and having that basic healthy diet for now. So is there any I sense you think the EU may use that as a bit of bargaining chip because it's not specifically on the agenda. But what is the likelihood of that happening in your opinion, and what's the alternatives? And I suppose just maybe a line to that is, do you think there's a good understanding? We all understand the difficulty at our ports in Northern Ireland over the first 6 months until we get fully ready, and we will have some solutions in place in the short term. But I suspect there's going to be significant difficulties at ports going from Northern Ireland to GB, and I just wonder how well known that is by the authorities in England and Scotland and Wales, because obviously that's a huge export market for the North, particularly for the food sector. Thank you.
That's a good question, Colin. I mean, so far the most substantial thing that we've had from the UK government on this is the Trader Support Service, which, as you know, has been rather disappointing and does rather less than what we'd sort of been led to believe that it might do. So essentially, it's directing people towards, the essentials and towards customs brokers. It's not the same as, as a sort of the trusted trader scheme, and we haven't had, despite all of the, despite all of the claims and the information that was being given around those, trusted trader schemes and potential innovative schemes for moving across the Irish border, for example, we haven't seen a rollout of those, of a kind of a similar means of enabling, especially movement of goods, especially of agri-food into Northern Ireland, or indeed GB into EU. And so I think this is, that's a big gap. And hence, the expectation or the hope that there could be agreement at the UK EU level with regards to simplifications, particularly around export health certificates for movements from GB into NI. But on most fronts, such as the goods vehicle movement system, the customs declaration system, the trader support service that I mentioned, it seems to be that there isn't nearly enough detail. They haven't been tested. There's many people already identifying huge gaps in those. So yeah, I think this is why there is such concern about 1st of January, regardless of the existence of border control posts or not. The 1st of January simply not being realistic as something for enabling the smooth flow of goods, particularly from GB into NI. And this is why it sort of comes down to the question of, well, will we have basically a protocol operational in name only, but like the Brexit name only point, you know, and hence that need primarily for that agreement between the UK and the EU to allow that relationship of trust. I haven't heard so much about the NI to GB. Colin, I'd be interested to hear more about that in terms of what worries you have in particular.
No, I think that an awful lot of the concentration around the protocol has understandably been about GBDNI, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that particularly in the agri-food sector, we do rely very heavily on the GB market, and I'm just not I'm not aware that the work that will need to be done or what other checks may need to happen in terms of moving from Northern Ireland producers, and I think particularly the red meat sector and the sector into the GB market post 1st of January, and are the ports ready for whatever other checks have to take place?
I haven't heard much on that too. I mean, the UK Internal Market Bill was meant to address that in some regard, in terms of market access, even aside from unfettered access, and there's an important distinction between them. But yeah, that is. There's still a lot of work to be done on that. Yeah, but essentially, I think there's a difference between what the UK government itself can manage as under its own jurisdiction, if you like, and what it has to negotiate with the EU. And that's the irony of this, is that it has to negotiate with the EU what's coming from GB into NI, but NI into GB, with the setting aside the exit summary declarations for now, that's up to the UK itself. And definitely we're getting that impression that the UK government is prioritizing flow over control, if you like. So the essential principle is, and I stand to be corrected on this, but I think the principle is that it'll be maintaining the status quo as much as possible where it can, and NI to GB is very much within that.
Okay, thank you. I have 100 other questions, but we get those at another time. And I'll back to David.
Sorry, Katie, did you want to ask a question yourself? And then I have a couple of questions just picking up on stuff that's in the chat room.
Yeah, it's just a very quick question to Simon and maybe to Neil. What's your impression of how well aware businesses are in the south of the protocol and the fact that it enables a free movement of goods on the island of Ireland? I think there's a concern here maybe that people associate Northern Ireland with just UK, and there's been too little distinction between Northern Ireland and GB in that regard. What's your impression of that?
Yeah, it's a good observation, because I think it is mixed again. I think some people would understand that it does mean, no restrictions. Others, I think, are possibly assuming that it does mean that you'd need the same paperwork as you would going to the UK effectively. So it is a bit disappointing actually that they haven't managed to promote the fact that it's not just about not having the physical infrastructure, which is what people have been worried about from a security point of view. It is actually about maintaining the free trade. So I think those who are like the likes of Guinness, who are shipping I think 10 or 15 trucks a day between Belfast for bottling and Dublin for brewing, they'll have understood it. But I think those who are maybe infrequently trading with the North probably don't have a good understanding of it.
Yeah, I would add to that. It will be one of those areas of, and it's always difficult because of the border question. You'd want a bit of publicity about. The other thing that I've heard quietly said, and some on the call will know this more than I, that the long run proposition of that freedom is helpful for future inward investment into the island, where, you know, we'd be out doing lots of trade missions as others are with clients, and those wanting to invest in Ireland. Now, typically for our firm, that would be looking into ROI, but very often now the idea that post 1st of Jan, we might be able to say, but also for your footprint and your sales into UK, actually the island's a good place, so you can have some of your base here in the Republic of Ireland, and you can have an office or not. So the potential for some of that partnership and a good landing spot for EU and GB sales is one of the long-term sales. But I was told very quietly by a few people in the negotiation side, look, there are real ways that Northern Ireland could have some big upsides in this around that kind of footprint. But it's very contentious with the Scots and the Welsh and everyone else as to what sort of preferential treatment. So if you can just try and be a little bit circumspect with any of the selling new Northern Ireland until we get what the shape of the deal is, and maybe there's more paperwork, GPNI, maybe there's some complexity of that, and, you know, but nearly everything that's on a ship has some paper anyway. It's a question of how that can be adjusted. But this potential of, as an island location, to have twin bases and maybe increase that trade and partnership that Katie talked about, I think that is important. But maybe it can't be as well articulated for fear of some of the impact it might have in negotiations. But to Simon's point, the big firms are ready for almost anything, or if they're not, they'll be very quickly. My concern is those who are just ignoring it, or, to be fair, that's doing them a disservice. Some of them are so busy just about dealing everything. Like, I'm supposed to be an economist and reasonably intelligent, he says with his funny face. But when it comes to my end of year accounts and all the things I have to do, the accountant keeps saying to me, how can you know so little about this, Neil, and why you needed this? And I just say, if I could think about it, I would, but I'm just too busy. So a lot of our firms are saying, I'm just surviving here. It's not that I'm not going to these trade missions or listening or downloading the paperwork. I just don't know. So I think, Katie, there is a level of a lack of awareness of what some of those freedoms will be, partly because of just not taking the time to think about it. And that maybe is an early January exercise that will be required to remind people of some of the opportunities that might be there of new trade they didn't have before, because they hadn't thought in that way, north-south. They've been thinking in a different direction.
Could I just pick up on a couple of points about the labour market? You know, I think, Neil, you acknowledged there the Audit Office report this week, which has highlighted there are a lot of vacancies in the civil service. There are clearly a lot of vacancies in the health service. And yet, I suppose that reflects the fact that before the COVID crisis, the labour market actually position was very good. We had, I suppose, what an economist might call pretty much full employment. But we're now obviously going to have a lot of people coming out of furlough at some stage. And I suppose we're going to have a lot of people working in sectors that aren't going to have a great future, for want of a better term. And perhaps a need for reskilling large numbers of people to go into those areas where there is going to be a better future. I'm maybe going to turn to Simon first just on that and say, you know, is there anything the Irish government is doing in recognition of this challenge that, you know, we might learn from up here?
I'm not aware of something specific. I mean, I think the government here have been, maybe starting as a general comment, they've been like, excuse me, every other government and every other civil service, that they have been up and down on those specific things because they're being diverted by COVID as well. And then the preparations in terms of hard infrastructure and everything else for Brexit seem to be actually quite well advanced, and certainly better than equivalent ports in particular in the UK. And then I think at the moment, like in terms of supports, the budget announced an envelope, but not specific measures. So again, there may be holding fire on some of the specific things that they may do to follow up, depending on where we land on a deal or no deal.
And on the point is a good one about, you know, the vacancies, the jobs that may be available, but this is going to require a bit of change on both sides really of the equation. So some of the jobs will come back very vigorously, as I said. I think we will find some of the elements of tourism and some of the elements of retail not needing the numbers in the same way or guise as they did before. But one of the things we're going to have to change, we're doing it, and I'm sure you will too, it was mentioned in that report, is exactly how you're going to hire. So the civil service, for all its positivity around purpose-led, making a difference, serving better working world, stuff that we hold close to our heart, something you can sell easily, it is also seen as a quote-unquote elite profession. It's in the doctors, lawyers. So there's a lot of people who think they have absolutely no chance of getting into it. So the question for a lot of organizations, public service included, is the recruitment process up to it? So are you doing the right outreach to get to the people? Are you willing to take on academies or apprenticeships to say, these people don't have the typical qualifications we have in this role, but what we're going to do is take them in for 12 weeks, twice the number we need. They're going to get a certificate at the end of those 12 or 24 weeks. That will help them even if we don't keep them on. And we might find talent that can do the jobs we need that we didn't think. Because we have, because of the amount of people who normally apply, we have a lot of false hurdles in our recruitment policies to say, well, we think we need this number of GCSEs, A-levels, degree. When I ran Oxford Economics, the best thing I ever did was take away the requirement of an economics degree, because all I said, you had to have an interest in the subject. I got political scientists, geographers, and that company still doing well today was because of the diversity of view. And we have to reach people that typically, so those retail workers, those front of office people in hotels who have brilliant customer ready skills, think of the things they could do for us in lines of public service, but they probably would never think of that as a career or a choice. So a lot of work needs to be done to sell the job, to sell what the old school ideas of it's a great job with a pension, a long-term future. You need more than that to really get at the people you might want. So I think apprenticeship schemes, 12-week summer placements, really showing doing as a public servant or a public organization what we often ask the private sector to do to be a quote-unquote good employer. I think that's the real opportunity, David, is to help in that retraining, reskilling. We know there's going to be digital programs. We know our universities and FE colleges have some gaps in their finances, so they'll be willing to stand up and help with some of the training programs, academies, etc. that might be needed. And then the last point I'd make on the labour market too is the concern that I have, and I know shared by DFC colleagues, that one of the dangers is we're going to have a big pool of people. Maybe unemployment will hit 100,000. I think it'll maybe come in a bit below that. But even if it's at 80,000, suddenly we'll now have a cohort of people who are close to the labour market. And that's good for them. And it means their chances of rehiring is high. But think of those long-term problems we had of inactivity or poverty or worklessness or our low levels of employment for people with disabilities. We have to be certain and careful that we don't move to the easy to solve because we can do well at it and ignore the really hard problems that were our focus before this crisis hit. So I don't want to see us reneging on some of those commitments to get at the hardest they reach just because there are easier to reach due to this pandemic. So I think that's one of our duties of care, is to keep some of those big thorny issues still near the top of the agenda and not pushed back due to the kind of emergency creating jobs agenda that we might have.
One very quick one as well, just on the difference in the civil service. Interesting here that there is now no conversation that I've seen about withdrawing pay increases or anything like that for the civil service, whereas the Chancellor this morning has been flagging that Christmas may be cancelled for the public sector in the UK. So that always helps with attraction, that you're continuing to minimise the headline salary gaps, leaving aside issues about pensions and everything else.
Okay, thanks. Just we're getting close to time. There's a couple of questions there. One just about what's this going to look like for the average citizen, and particularly in and around our ports. And also is a question there about, is there a risk that we might see a rise in illegal activity, human trafficking and all the rest? And I'm going to be very unfair here. I see Bonnie Anley from Londonderry Port and Harbour Commission is there. Are you still there, Bonnie? You're at the sharp end of all of this. Yeah. Anything you want to say just on those particular points?
Well, thank you, David. And yes, I was doing a lot of very constructive listening there. I mean, from the port's perspective, it's fair to say that Foyle, where I'm chair of Londonderry Port and Harbour Commissioners, we're not a roll-on, roll-off port, and obviously ports have a different model on the eastern seaboard, and they will be affected depending on their model, particularly when it comes to the roll-on, roll-off ferry traffic. I know that there's a lot of emphasis on the haulier and on the operator as opposed to the port facility. So that does increase the risk of issues in relation to, I see Heather's made the point there about ports possibly being backed up. I think there's an awful lot of pressure on the operator to get the system right, but they don't yet know what that actually is. Getting an authorized operator status or an AO status for customers is actually quite difficult. We have it, and a lot of the port operators have it, a lot of the bigger customers have it, but it's the little guy or the middle guy who doesn't. So yes, there will be some risk of a certain amount of disruption. And I would imagine from the port point of view, we've also been at the mercy of political ideology as compared to practical application. So some of our ministers have been particularly upset at the fact that, and I don't want to say anything too contentious here, but in practical terms, Northern Ireland is leaving the UK in January. You know, in terms of what this means, you know, we have to think about it potentially in that way without getting into the politics of it. So there is a free port initiative. I have to say that the NICS have been very slow to see any advantage to that. There's been a lot of dragging of heels. It's badly named because it isn't necessarily a port incentive, but it's about economic zones. It's about tax and fiscal advantages that could potentially link some of the trust ports, including the universities, using innovation as a headline, and build something in Northern Ireland that, as Neil says, could then link into the Republic of Ireland and use the whole island as a potential opportunity. But from the port's perspective, I can report that there is a lot of grey area. I've met quite frequently with the other port chairs and chief executives. They haven't not asked the difficult questions the whole way along. It's just they haven't had any answers. So we're building as much as we can in terms of infrastructure and kind of waiting and seeing, I think is probably the best way of putting it. But thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie, and sorry for dropping in it there. That was very helpful. Evelyn Collins there just asked a couple of questions, or made a point actually about implications for equality and human rights. Evelyn, if you're still there, do you want to just come in on that particular point, and then we'll maybe try and bring it to a close?
Yes, no, thanks, David. I was just using the chat as a means to inform people because Katie had mentioned that we're mentioned in the protocol. We certainly do a lot of work to raise awareness, but it is very important for us all to understand the UK government has made a commitment that they won't, as a result of Brexit, diminish any certain equality and human rights in Northern Ireland. And that has implications, of course, for our legal framework going forward. There's an important element of it, which is future facing. So as legislation may change in Brussels, it will change in Northern Ireland too, and perhaps not in the rest of GB. So there's a lot of work that we're doing with the Human Rights Commission to get ready to play that role, and certainly very happy to continue to inform public sector colleagues about that. But the point I was making really, it's important for business too, because obviously the equality frameworks which have underpinned business have helped to secure greater equality opportunity here, and we don't want to see any damage done to that going forward. Thanks, David. Okay, thanks, Evelyn. I haven't seen any fresh questions. Anybody want to add anything? Sorry, Katie, do you want to come in? Yeah.
Yeah, I could just try and quickly answer those questions about what Joe Citizen will experience. I did something recently for UK Changing Europe, which was basically answering that question. And it was really notable just how different it is for Northern Ireland. So regardless of whether there's a deal or not, just the fundamental changes will be obviously British passport holders entering the EU in terms of travel will be going through the different channels, won't have obviously automatic right to reside and work in the EU countries. On a more positive note, again, regardless of whether there's UK-EU deal or not, the Irish government has promised in its Brexit omnibus bill to have something similar to an EHIC arrangement for all residents or eligible residents in Northern Ireland for accessing healthcare in the EU, and also with regards to Erasmus programme. Again, through the Irish government has promised to arrange something for that for all students in NI universities. So that's some positive side. In terms of driving, we'll all need green cards for driving across the border in terms of motor insurance. people in Northern Ireland who have Irish driver's licenses are advised to change those to UK driver's licenses. And data roaming, there's no guarantee that that will continue, of course. And then in terms of what we'll see maybe on the shelves, I mean, this is a cause for great concern, and I do expect there to be less consumer choice and higher prices, not necessarily directly as a result of the protocol. I think the priority will be to avoid any dramatics and spectacles around the NI ports, but we will see some of that definitely in GB. Because the EU will be implementing the new regime from the 1st of January, and that will no doubt create a backlog in GB ports entering the EU. So we'll see headlines around that, but hopefully it won't affect here in a similar way, but there will be knock-on effects in terms of prices and choice, I'm sure. And just on the immigration question, yeah, there are concerns about human trafficking. Again, in terms of what we see, so it's basically, I suspect there'll be more in-country immigration checks in Northern Ireland, and we will probably see, you know, more control, more checks on NI to GB movement, albeit surreptitiously in some cases. I think that'll just be part of what the way that the UK manages its borders going forward. And just one small point is possibly a slightly sarky one, but the UK border strategy consultation of 2025 said that the UK has 270 entry points in its border. Bearing in mind that there's 280 odd on the Irish border, it sort of shows that, you know, again, there's always just that distinct position of Northern Ireland isn't necessarily always at the forefront of UK policy when it comes to borders.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I will sort of draw it to a close now, and again want to thank our three excellent speakers. It's been a really informative session, some good questions. You know, taken together, these are enormous challenges, and as I sort of slightly facetiously said at a previous session, you can look at this two ways. As a public service leader, you know, it's either what a great time to be alive or what a great time to retire. So you know which choice I have made. But being serious, this is going to require enormous flexibility and agility by the public sector. And I think we have shown over the last 8 or 9 months that we can be agile, we can be flexible, we can be much more collaborative than we maybe have been in the past. And we need to make sure, I think, as we rise to these challenges, that we don't slip into old ways of working, because if we do, we will not actually deliver the outcomes that our citizens really need at this particular time. So, you know, I think this has been a really good session, and I think there's an awful lot that probably is worth developing in future sessions as well. So again, final thanks to Katie, Neil and Simon, and thanks to all the rest of you for attending. And please give us feedback, and Anne, I think the slides will be circulated to all those who've attended. And anything else need to be said just before we wrap up?
No, just to echo those thanks to our three speakers and to everyone for coming along today and engaging so fully, and lots more on all of these topics in the coming months from CEF, so stay tuned.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good weekend.
Cheerio, thanks.